This is a quick 5-minute myofascia release for hips and lower back. So if you'd like to come down to the floor, lying on your back, and just take a few minutes just to let your awareness come into the breath, breathing in and out through the nose. Let the back of the head settle to the ground so that the chin is engaged to draw downwards rather than lifting up towards the ceiling. As you breathe, breathe and soften through into the diaphragm and allow the rib cage to freely open and soften. Let the shoulders open broad and the pelvis open broad. So breath awareness in and out through the nostrils, letting the weight of the body release to the ground. Feel the connection of the feet drawing into the floor. So our first movement is just drawing the right knee in towards the chest, taking hold either with both hands on the top of the knee or behind the back of the thigh, whichever feels more comfortable. And again, as you breathe out, just allowing the thigh to settle down on towards the abdomen, opening the space into the glutes and allowing the softening into the front of the hip. Make sure that as your knee is drawn up, the head hasn't lifted upwards. So keep that sense of leaning the back of the head to the ground. And again, nice, quiet, soft breath, working into the abdomen. And then very quietly, and we don't want a big movement here, we just want a little movement of round and round of the top of the leg coming into the hip. So we don't want to feel the whole of the pelvis moving side to side, just that sensation of lift, of moving the top of the leg into the hip joint itself. So don't take the action with the leg. Allow the arm to do most of the steering movement. And the quality of the movement will become easier as the fluid increases and the fascial connections start to warm up. And then once there's that nice easy sense of sliding of the leg into the hip socket, let's move around in the other direction. So depending on the shape of the leg coming into the hip will depend a little bit on how easy the movement is. You might find there's sort of almost a little hiccup as the leg moves around. So just find that point where there is a nice smooth movement. So let's place that other foot down to the ground. And again, soft breath, make sure the chin hasn't tipped up again, broadening out into the widest part of the back. So other knee into the chest, and again it's up to you to choose behind the thigh or into the top of the knee. Breathing quietly, not taking control in the leg, just allowing the leg to soften. And as you allow the leg to soften, let the spine release. You find that again the opening happens through into the back buttock. And that release again through into the front hip, working into the outside. The other foot that's onto the ground, keep that foot nice and active. So when we start to create the movement round, if you find the pelvis is moving side to side, then the knee and the foot will follow. So if we keep that foot nicely connected to the ground and look for the isolation of movement of the leg into the joint, it gives you a good clue of the way that the body finds the easiest movement, and then restricting movement in the other places. So again, nice little movement. So it's not a really big wide circle, sort of just almost that head of the leg into the hip joint. And once it starts to ooze and move really freely, then you can change direction, moving round. I like to use the idea of seeing a butcher's joint. You can see how the joint of the bones, sorry, a butcher's bones, so you can see how the bone is nice and shiny and all that connective tissue just helps that ease of movement round. So I've worked a little bit more on this movement in the second direction than I did in the first. Just that's how my hips have preferred the movement. So let's place both feet down onto the floor, hands coming down by your hips, and again leaning the weight of the head into the floor to allow that mid-spine curve to start to soften a little bit. The next movement, your feet can come a little bit closer up towards your buttocks. Allow your toes to lengthen out. And we're just lifting the seat of the pants away from the ground by pressing your feet, your heels and your big toes into the floor and allowing the pelvis to lever away from the ground. So your glutes and those muscles that you might engage to lift the pelvis up aren't really working particularly hard. Just the effort comes from pressing your feet to the ground, and so maybe your thighs work a little bit. So I can place my hands underneath my buttocks there and let them just slide. And then again, focusing the breath, moving down through into the front of the hips, letting the back of the head release into the ground. And breathing to open this space between the front of the hips and the bottom of the rib cage, and allow the tail and the sacrum just to lengthen out a little bit more. So we're flattening the curve of the lumbar spine by taking away the tension with the pelvis connecting to the floor. Again, working nicely with the breath, and then allowing your lower back to connect down into the floor. And you might find that you think you've connected to the ground, and actually if you release and give a little bit more, there's a complete movement that happens right the way down into the lower spine. So you might find that the front of the abdomen has really opened and there's more space into the hip flexors. So again, pressing your feet to the ground, just allowing the hanging out of the pelvis. So that slight lift up, breathing into the deep abdominals. Lovely quiet movement. So repeating this movement as many times as feels comfortable, and that release and the drop down of the sacrum, of letting the tail lengthen, and you just find there's beautiful space in the lower back and takes away that tensioning into the lumbar vertebrae.